Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. As always, it's my pleasure to have back with me today Charles Hugh Smith, well followed and a prolific writer on the web who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Welcome back, Charles. How quickly 5 weeks goes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gordon. Well, I'm looking forward to today's topic, which I think is of the utmost importance.
Charles, before we begin, as I normally do, I need to stress with our new viewers that this is not an interview. We do these videos as a way of us productively dialoguing the important trends we are identifying and simply make our discussion available to the public for those that might be interested or want to contribute comments, which we welcome. Today we're going to talk about the expansion of the media's control of the public narrative, a source of major concern, as I just said. As such, we hope to cover the subject areas listed here. Any comments on this agenda, Charles?
No, it's just I'm looking forward to covering your excellent agenda here and then filling in a little bit of my own experience in being shadow banned. Like, this is not an abstraction to us.
No, it's not. This is real world with real examples impacting revenues to many of our friends. I thought we'd kick this off with a reminder, Charles, of our First Amendment rights, because that's what this is really about, and how exactly they are now under attack. When the First Amendment was written, the media, our elected representatives, and we the people were on the same side. That is below this red line. The amendment was intended to protect we the people from the encroachment of government in regards to our inalienable rights. It therefore also protected the freedom of the press as our watchdogs on government for we the people. But times have changed, and instead of a bottom-up system, we effectively now have a top-down system where our protectors have actually switched sides. The media is now an extension of the political apparatus. Politicians are controlled, in my opinion, by their party and reacting to media coverage. Unelected party bosses are truly the ones that are in control, and campaign funding dictates policies. And as we'll discuss today, the media now sells narrative and censors opposing narrative. What we have is top-down versus bottom-up control of the messaging and public consensus. And we, the people, have lost our voice, in my opinion. The government has stopped listening, and as such is freed, therefore, from accountability. A bureaucracy of unelected or appointed officials is now basically in control. And what we need to fully appreciate today is that the media is now a commodity that can and is, frankly, bought. Propaganda, or what is euphemistically called narrative, is not news any longer. It doesn't actually inform the electorate. What it is a tool for the powers to be to sell their agenda. That's the major transformation that I believe we've been going through. Charles, comments on these slides?
I'll just pick up on your last slide, which I think really summarizes the situation, whether it's bottom up, top down, that the government and the public are supposed to have a feedback, right? In other words, government representatives and unelected officials present policy recommendations or changes to the public, and then the public has the opportunity to give feedback. In other words, to approve or disapprove of that, or throw out some other ideas. And what we have now is and that's called the consent of the governed, right? That was the terminology that's been used for the whole lifetime of modern democracy, which is the people consent to the government's control because it serves the public interest. And now what you're describing is those people in control at the top of the wealth power pyramid, they're now using the media to convince, persuade, or browbeat people into giving the consent of the governed. But it's not a free choice anymore because, as you say, our voice has really been reduced. And there was a famous study about 5 years ago where some academics went back and looked at how much of the decisions in Congress actually were responding to the public as opposed to corporate lobbyists, and so on. And they basically concluded that the public doesn't count. And so it doesn't count politically, and now it doesn't count in terms of free speech either.
Every day it's becoming more and more evident to a larger audience of the public, in my opinion. So how did we get there? Well, we have witnessed a dangerous consolidation of the U.S. media. What we've recently witnessed from the media is the disappearance of newspapers as a major media source. That's where our evolution came from. It's gone. Instead, we have replaced it by a massive new media consolidation, controlling what we see and what we read. And it's controlled through 6 big news networks, 3 big social media platforms, 3 dominant news wires, that is Reuters, Associated Press, and Bloomberg, and only 3 remaining major newspapers, the Washington Post, in my opinion, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal. Observations on that, Charles? You agree with what this consolidation has been?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting from comparing to what antitrust and what was considered acceptable in the past, now all these big media corporations own multiple media types and forms. In other words, it used to be that a newspaper would be couldn't buy a radio station or a TV station, because then that would be obviously pushing into a monopolistic dominance, right, in a number of media types and markets. Well, now these six big corporations own virtually every aspect of every media. They, it's not just they own a newspaper or a website; they own everything. And so that consolidation into like a cartel or a monopoly is extremely dangerous in any industry. And now we're talking about that kind of dominance of a handful of private players in our free press. And that's really frightening.
We'll talk a little bit further later, Charles, when we get into following the money. And it has to do with, as you said, these have become monopolies or cartels, and they don't want to be broken up. And you can see how their approaches have shifted to stop themselves from being broken up, and how they support and who they support and in what ways. What this concentration has fostered is a change in news reporting. Gone are the days of Walter Cronkite, for those who remember his style of reporting, the newspaper reporters of his day. Gone are the days of reporting who, what, when, why, and how kind of journalism. What we have is modern journalism, which now actually teaches what is referred to as advocacy journalism. And it teaches the reporting of one side of a story is referred to as advocacy positioning. The narrative is the side being advocated. It's exactly the same as a lawyer who argues one side and does not tell or avoids and ignores the other side. They see that as not being their job, obviously. The goal here is to promote a directed narrative in the news. And indications are that it has now actually migrated even further with what is called fake news. So now we're seeing no sources, no collaboration, circular reporting on this as we've moved into this world of them selling narrative. And we'll talk about how it's sold. Charles, your comments on what you refer here to as the Decayed Wall?
And this is based on my experience as a freelance writer for newspapers and magazines from the late 80s until the dominance of the web. And so I'm speaking as someone who was assigned stories by an editor in my specialty, which was urban design and related topics. And at that time, the editors were extremely wary of covering, of appearing to give favorable coverage to big advertisers, or in fact any special interest. And as you say, the idea was that we were told we needed to find 3 sources and cover both sides of the story. If there was 2 sides, or if there was issues or complications, we needed to find sources who could speak authoritatively, or at least informed people to help explain these complicated topics to the public. So now that wall is, in my view, broken down, so that the corporate owners of media no longer really respect that idea that they shouldn't favor special interests or big advertisers, or, in other words, where they're getting their money. And so that's a moral breakdown. We've had a moral collapse, if you will, in the media. And so what this led to is, and we've talked about, Orwell and Kafka, in previous programs, but it's led to this disconnect where the media is pursuing these narratives which serve special interests, essentially. And they're telling us this is the way the world is, and yet with our own eyes we're seeing a different reality. And so there's this very strange disconnect, where it's the term is, well, what are you going to believe, us or your lying eyes? And that's really disturbing, because it's almost a form of schizophrenia. You read the official approved account of what's happening, and then you look around with your own eyes and you're finding this disconnect that cannot be resolved.
Well said, Charles. I don't know how many times I feel like that, and I've actually used that expression. What am I going to believe? My lying eyes? And listen to what I'm being told? The disconnect is just massive. And what we're also witnessing is what I show here and what I call unified messaging from these news sources. It's the same message across all the platforms, not just one platform or two, all of them. They'll actually use the exact same words. It's like they have been issued identical talking points. I might be overstating it. When you flip the channels, it's just clear whatever the narrative is and how they just use the same words, same talking points, and the identical, what I'll call dog whistle rhetoric to the market segment that they're pandering to, where they're getting their money from. And most alarming, we are seeing censorship, as you just talked about. Instead of a freedom of the press, we're witnessing it using its freedoms as press to censor what we the people are actually allowed to see and hear. Charles, maybe you want to talk further about what you see as a decline of what you call the free range internet and black box censorship.
You mentioned the phrase circular reporting, and this is where a weak, or really a source that would not withstand any scrutiny, is then referred to as authoritative. And then another media picks up the fact that it was in the Washington Post, for example, and then says, well, the Washington Post declared this authoritative, so now we can use it. And so this circular reporting of sources, and then you go back to the original source, if you can weed through all that, circular reference, you discover that source is actually bogus. And I can give you a quick example, which is called Prop or Not. This was a website that came out of nowhere in 2016, and the Washington Post published a huge front page story about how this authoritative site was listing all the websites that were Russian influenced. And of course, my site, Of Two Minds, and hundreds of other legitimate sites were listed as Russian tools, essentially, because we questioned some aspect of Hillary Clinton's election in 2016 as perhaps maybe not the best choice for the nation. And so we were then basically blackballed, and yet the Washington Post did not even ask who owns this site or who runs it, who's responsible. Those people were hidden, and yet they published this slam on all of us as if it was authoritative. And so this is where this dominance of privately owned corporations gets to be extremely dangerous, as opposed to the way the internet was in the late 1990s and early 2000s, before the dominance of social media and these corporations. Is it was a free for all. People had all these blogs and podcasts, and everybody was as a citizen, you were basically given the right or the privilege to sort the wheat from the chaff. You could decide whether the source was authoritative, or you could do the research yourself, right? No one was doing that kind of gatekeeping for you. Now we have groupthink, which, as we've discussed in the past, is a manifestation of Orwell's 1984, a homogenization of the news to where ideas that don't fit the narrative simply aren't presented. they're buried as fake news or a questionable source. And so what happens is we're basically told to love our servitude, to use Huxley's term. And anybody that doesn't love their servitude gets blackballed by these private corporations. And what happens with this shadow banning? And so I was shadow banned as soon as Prop or Not got publicized by the Washington Post as, the truth, when it was all just basically lies, right? None of us were controlled by the Russians. And then what happens is you don't know whether you've been banned or not. In other words, so you go and you put a post on Facebook or a tweet on Twitter, or you post something that Google scans. You don't know who's seeing that. In other words, nobody tells you your site has been shadow banned. They simply stop showing your content to the vast majority of your audience. And there's no legal recourse to this. In other words, if you get shadow banned or banned outright, you don't have any legal recourse. There's no way that you can go to a court and say, my free speech has been infringed. It's like, no, you agreed to our terms of use by posting something. And our terms of use are we own everything you post, and we have complete, total control over what we do with your content, including blocking it. And so this is opaque censorship and what I call private sector totalitarianism. And that's a tough word, but we really shouldn't mince words. It is. It's a private sector totalitarianism. And so it leads me to call my term for the U.S. now, the USA, is USSA, the United Simulacra States of America, because our free speech really is now just a simulation. It's a simulacrum of an actual free press.
My observation is we've allowed censorship, starting with its apparent claims to be addressing hate speech and fact-checking, to lead to, as you're saying, shadow banning, demonetization, other emerging methods to penalize people who are actually expressing opinions. You demonetize anybody, there's more money coming in. It's only a matter of time before they're going to do something else. And now we're seeing forced self-censorship through cancel culture, political correctness, wokeism, if I can use that as a term. It's just getting worse and worse at a faster rate. Have you any other first-hand experiences in that regard, Charles, that you haven't mentioned already?
You're really spot on to bring up self-censorship, because those of us who make some sort of living or have an income stream from posting content, right, in any media, we now realize that if we don't toe the line, like if you question these mRNA vaccines, or if you question the legitimacy of the voting machines and election process, then you're very likely to be shadow banned and or demonetized, right? Because you're not supporting the approved narrative, and so then you pull back, you hesitate to post things that are controversial, and so this is a very negative, a very heavy suppression, which is internal, right? And this is exactly like the way that the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and other totalitarian states is they make everybody afraid to speak out, right? Because bad things will happen to you. And so then you just keep quiet. And you have a link here for a doctor who was speaking on this medication that's been, there's a lot of evidence that it's effective in treating COVID-19, but it's basically been discounted or even banned by the official narrative, right? And so it's this kind of thing when you watch this and you go, how come we can't hear this on the mainstream media? And how come we're getting banned if we even post this? You realize the depth of the totalitarianism that we already experience.
To make sense of why this is happening, as is usual in America, you simply have to follow the money. And there's a number of points I think we need to make here to tie some of this together. And one of them is something you came up with as a terminology called data harvesting. Do you want to make some observations on what you call data harvesting?
Yeah, real quick. You know, the way that the media, whether it's print, audio, visual, any media, the way that they used to make money was they would sell an ad, right? It would be a display ad in a newspaper or magazine, or an ad on TV, or an ad on the internet, right? And that model has changed, and so they still sell ads, but now the big money is made by harvesting all the data from your social media and search activity, and then selling that to advertisers. And so in order to collect as much data as they can, they need to engage you so that you'll spend more time on Facebook, Twitter, and do more searches on Google. And so the way they do that is they seek out content that will polarize the public and trigger emotional, basically disruptions, right? And highly destructive emotions within viewers, and then they'll also kind of manage the flow of content to trigger like addictive FOMO, fear of missing out, so that especially young people, they get addicted to their phones where they're having to check it hundreds of times a day to see who posted a new Instagram photo or something like that. All of this does not serve the public good or the individual user. What it serves is their data collection, and that's why they're worth trillions of dollars now. Is that they're reaping enormous cash flows from selling the data collected from users, and by using their basically psychological manipulation to get people to stay engaged and give them more data that they can then sell. And so this is completely different than a display ad, which you can just ignore, you know. And this has given these huge, billions and billions of dollars of revenues and profits have given them tremendous political power. And now we're starting to see that too.
This shift to what you just called and we call polarization is the new business model and what drives their profits in regards to what you've just said with data harvesting. But through the narrative and censorship, it creates markets which allow campaign finance laws themselves to be circumvented. And, then what's that got to do with anything? But for example, the media, by censoring, is in effect doing an in-kind of political contribution to a party without being restricted by campaign finance. And that in-kind is not an ad, it's censoring out information that might be helpful in giving the electorate a broader view. They do this also to get antitrust protection and favorable regulatory arbitrage ruling for the political direction or party that it's supporting or it is favoring with its narrative, or whether that narrative is bought to support that views. But it does all tie together. It also allows massive foreign influence to happen. It is reported that, for example, China gave the U.S. voting machine company Dominion $400 million 2 weeks before the U.S. election. Now, if that's true, that begs some serious questions, especially with the broad assertions of voter fraud by these machines. I'm just saying it begs questions. I'm not trying to say it's fact because I don't know, but I've certainly seen hundreds of articles on this. But we also now have activist, tax-deductible, charitable organizations which are raising massive amounts of money that is flowing into campaign finance without any kind of controls because it circumvents all the old controls. And so what's this mean? It means, for example, and people aren't aware of this, it allowed Mark Zuckerberg, the owner, if you would, but the chairman of Facebook, to gift tax-free with other coordinated activist charities $500 million in the last election for specific county and city changes to the election process. That's a fact. That's well documented. It happened. And it's in the courts. with no media coverage, because what we're really seeing, it's frankly exculpatory evidence for their narrative. They don't talk about the other side of it. But these are the realities of where it's going, and just the numbers I'm kicking out here. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. That's what narrative is about. That's what news is about today. It's about selling the narrative, because that's where the real money. And as you said, Charles, it's not in product advertising. That's nickels and dime business. So what does this mean to us today? We, the people, I believe, may be losing our voice now, even at the polls, as I just kind of give the examples I've given. The electoral process is our last possible bastion for expressing our views from the slides I started with on our First Amendment rights, the shift from bottoms up to tops down. And the media is now the catalyst for creating change to support globalist views like the Great Reset, which they are currently propagating. I just released 40 plus slide set video explaining how the Great Reset is actually being sold, and I encourage viewers and listeners to see it at matasii.com. We showed this chart, Charles, in our last video, and we discussed it when we originally did it in 2013. It was part of my 2013 thesis paper entitled Statism. That is this whole roadmap we felt we were on at that period in time. And frankly, that's exactly what's happened here 7 years later. And so what we're seeing now is that we're nearly there, and we're witnessing with what I'll refer to as social suppression now. We already have financial repression, and we've talked about that for years. The macro-prudential policy that the Fed itself has put in to force us to take on more risk to finance the government spending. But now this is coupled with the media's social suppression, which is delivering a world that, as you said, Huxley, Orwell, Kafka all warned us about. It's here right now. Any comments on any of that, Charles?
I want to go back real quickly to a couple of key points you made that are part of this social suppression. And I think that that's really what we're talking about here, is how the structure of control, who's got the money, who's able to buy the narrative, and that's the source of social suppression, right? And that when you talked about campaign finance, and I just want to kind of mention that your point of in-kind giving is, it's just as important what's been hidden from us as what we're told, right? And that's what you're describing is part of this buying the narrative, is buying what we don't get to hear, what we're not exposed to. Because if you can bury corruption, then it's even better than having to discuss it, right? Because if nobody knows about it, well, then you're not going to get asked any questions. And of course, that's the whole point of democracy, is you have to have transparency and a transparent government and a transparent free press. Because if you're not allowed to know what's going on, then of course you've already lost all say. You have no say, as you've described. The other thing I want to mention real quickly is I think that people do not understand how these huge fortunes by billionaires have become what's called philanthrocapitalism. In other words, you sequester billions of dollars in a trust, which is supposedly for nonprofit, social welfare purposes, and then that structure allows you to make quasi-political contributions on a massive scale. They're not technically a campaign contribution to one candidate's election, and so therefore they're freed of these restraints. But the amounts of money, as you described, that are pouring into this whole buying of the narrative are just mind-boggling. And so this is also a complete distortion of what was intended by the founders in terms of a free press, right? So I just want to say that this social repression that you're describing is a confluence of a media that's controlled by private sector totalitarian corporations and by extremely wealthy individuals who use their wealth through trusts and other means of philanthrocapitalism to buy the narrative that supports their wealth and power.
When we did this slide, I tried to be kind and use the word statism years ago. But the reality is, the hard word is totalitarianism and fascism. That's what we're now at, or very close to. The message I'd like to give our listeners today, there's never been a time more where you need to take your voice and speak out with what you're seeing, what's going on, and you have to speak out to your congressmen, your senators, or whatever to get this message out, or we're going to lose our country. I feel that strongly about it, and it's in our face right now. This is not the time to sit back. This is the time now to speak up. And frankly, Charles, you and I doing this sort of video actually exposes us in many ways to the onslaught from the media. We have to be very careful with how we label things even now. Otherwise, we feel the direct revenue impact. Charles, you have any closing comments you want to make?
Yeah, I'd like to just say that I'm totally in support of what you just said, that, there's so much pressure to keep quiet, and that's the most dangerous part of totalitarianism. So we have to speak out, and there is a danger for anybody that speaks out that your YouTube channel will be, taken offline. You'll be banned by social media and so on. Because the key element of control here is to make sure that people don't get to see a full spectrum of opinion, and that, of course, takes out dissent, and dissent is the foundation of democracy. My last comment is, we've been reading in the mainstream media for quite a few years about the loss of trust, of public trust in our institutions. And now I think we're able to say at the end of this program, no wonder people have lost faith and trust in our institutions, because the institutions have been turned into self-serving mechanisms that support the narrative of those who are reaping the benefits at the top. And so that is not a healthy society or a healthy political structure or a healthy economy, and there will be consequences, and that's what you and I are fearful of, because you destroy trust in public institutions. There's going to be consequences.
What I have witnessed personally in the last 6 months is the institutions that we have long trusted are completely absent when they're most needed, whether through investigations, through appropriate justice within the courts, whether it's tracking foreign interference and then reporting on it. Some of this has to be transparent, but it's now worse than transparency. It's completely absent. And with it, that absence goes the public's disbelief and crisis of confidence and trust within the government, or what some people refer to as the swamp. And I've never seen it at such a level. I've seen recent studies where over 50% of the American people no longer trust the election process, and even higher amounts do not trust the U.S. government. This is serious, and when it gets to this level, bad things begin to happen. But I think that level-headed people that express themselves, their patriotism for the country, and stand up strongly for their beliefs because the truth always comes out, Charles. The one thing I know is that truth at the end of the day can't be suppressed. That's what brought down totalitarian governments. That's why they don't sustain themselves for any period of time, because they can't suppress the truth. But we don't need to go through and learn lessons that have been learned time and time again. We need to get the truth out in all that regard. Charles, so until we talk next, may I wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and I'll see you in the new year.
Thank you very much, Gordon.